Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with Emily Holmes, the owner of Mainely Apples. Emily's route to using science on a daily basis is pretty different than many of our guests, but her passion and appreciation for science are exactly the same. In the interest of full disclosure, and you'll hear us talk about it, I have been a longtime customer of Mainely Apples, and it was actually my visit this past fall that made me realize I had to have Emily on as a guest. If you're listening to this when it was released in early March 2025, please consider joining us at the 10th Maine Science Festival later this month, March 19th through 23rd. I've included a link to the MSF website, as well as links to some of the topics that Emily and I talked about, all found in the show notes. Our conversation was recorded in January 2025. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Emily, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I don't know if you realize that we have been a fan of Mainely Apples pretty much since the day we moved here 22 years ago. We brought our kids there in the midst of a hurricane, all sorts of different routines that we have of making sure that we get kind of the best apples, as far as I'm concerned, out there in the fall. So I'm really excited to talk to you on a personal level, but I'm super excited to talk to you about kind of the science that you use at the orchard, because it's really extensive. We met again this past fall and started having this conversation about all the different things you're managing from an orchard point of view. And all I could hear in my head was, that's science, that's science, that's science. It was endless. So if you don't mind, before we dive into what it takes to manage an orchard from my perspective, from a science point of view, like, what's your story with Mainely orchards? Right before we started recording, you said you rely on a lot of other scientists. My instinct is you're going to say that you don't have a science background. So I'm going to let you fill it in and tell us kind of what your background is and what it is about the orchard, and then we'll dive into the details.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Kate, for having me on today. I'm excited to talk about the orchard. It's my passion. It's my life. So I'll start at the beginning of the history of the orchard, and that is my life. So I was born in the year 1981. And in the winter of that year, I was born in August, that winter, my father and my mother, they were kind of back to the landers from New Jersey, had moved to Maine in the 70s. And they had bought up some farmland and were into cows and had some dairy cows. Not a lot, but just like a hobby farm. And that winter of 1981, my father was up on the roof shoveling and fell off the roof and broke his ankle rather badly. And so now my mother had my brother, who was 7 years older than me, and myself, a baby, and all these cows, and my father's laid up. And so my mom, who was trained as a teacher, she was an elementary teacher, but had stayed home with us, me and my brother. She did it for a while, as best she could, with the help of really generous neighbors. But ultimately, they decided the cows just was too much. So they ended up selling off the herd, keeping a couple just for themselves. And now they had these gigantic fields, about 15 to 17 acres of fields, and didn't know what to do. So my father, he wanted to be a farmer his whole life, had grown up in kind of in-town New Jersey. And so they said, well, hey, let's plant some apple trees. So in 1983, they planted the first 500 apple trees. And it kind of just grew from there. And so over the years, they added more trees. And then I kind of grew up and was in high school. And when I was in high school, early college, they decided to put in the cider press. So they put in a stainless steel cider press. And by that time, they were up to around 1,500 trees, had the cider press. I'm off at college. I went to Keene State College in New Hampshire. I have my bachelor's degree in English, actually. My brother was off at college. He has his doctorate in philosophy. And so we were kind of off in the world, not really interested in doing the orchard. And then I ended up at the Muskie School of Public Service in Portland. I have my master's certificate in community planning and development and was living in Portland. And then I met a guy who was also from rural Maine. And him and I were talking, and housing prices and things were rising down in the Portland area. So we decided, well, let's go back up to home and let's buy a house. We bought a house in Thorndike, Maine. And in the year 2006, we said, let's give the orchard a try. And so we moved back. And even though I grew up on the orchard and I did work there as a kid, things had grown and changed, and I didn't have a lot of knowledge. And so I depended on learning from my father and my mother about not only how to run an orchard, but how to run a business. There's kind of two real big facets to what we're doing. One is the business side and one is the orchard side. Both are equally difficult and equally rewarding. So I've been back, like 17 years now. Learned a lot in that time. Rely on a lot of other people that have taught me a lot of other orchardists, a lot of people at the University of Maine, a lot of people at the research station down in Monmouth. We're part of the Pomological Society, which relies on all other orchardists. We just all really support each other. So that kind of gets you up to modern day where I am now. I now live in Dixmont. We have 1,700 trees, 50 varieties of apples. We do make cider. My husband and I have taken over most all of the production. My husband and I have 4 children ranging in ages 4 to 16, and they help out as much as they can as children. My parents are still involved. They've slowed down quite a bit, but are still involved, and I still depend on them for lots of information all the time, every day. So that's where we are today.
So 50 different species of apples, which is way more than those of us who come and pick our favorites realize is going on there. I'm curious, is there a minimum number of trees of a species that you need to have to make it viable?
Well, yes and no. If you were building an orchard and starting this all over from scratch, which is what, my parents did, you do need to have different varieties of apples for cross-pollination. And certain varieties depend on different varieties to help pollinate them. The other thing that we have about 24 pear trees, different species of pears, and they were planted initially to help with cross-pollination as well. So the answer to that is yes, you do need different types of apples. Like if you were growing just 4 trees in your backyard, they could not all be the same variety. You need to have different ones for cross-pollination. But we do have some varieties that I only have a couple of trees of because we've tried different things. And some things have worked rather well and some things haven't. Some apples you read about in a catalog essentially and say, oh, here's what it tastes like. Here's what it looks like. It can grow in our zone. It's disease resistant. Let's try it. We plant it. You wait the 5 to 7 years for commercial production. You package them all up. You wash them all up. You put them in the farm stand. People don't like them. So it's kind of a learning curve that way. And we have replaced something. Some apples press better for cider than others. There's some apples I never use in cider just because of their characteristics. Like if we want to talk about the Macintosh apple, Macintosh is the most popular apple in Maine. We do grow Macintosh. They're some of the original trees that we have. We have different varieties of Macintosh under the umbrella of Macintosh, but however, they are very high in acid and do not press well. So I actually don't use them in my apple cider at all. They're just purely used for people fresh eating and baking and things like that. So to answer your question in a roundabout way, yes, you need more than one variety, but it's not like, oh, I need a dozen or I need 15. You can try just a couple of trees of this or that and see what works. And some things have taken off really well, like Cox's Orange Pippin, which is an old English apple people absolutely love. And we started out with just a few trees, and now I've got several rows of those because people just really, really like that apple and want to use it.
All right, you've said so many different things. I don't know which tangent to go off on. So I'm going to start with, no, it's awesome. This is great. Let's focus for a little bit on the cider because it's really interesting. And one of the conversations we had back in the fall was you talking about which apples you use for it. And that if I remember right, it's not drop apples, which is a common misperception. I could have that wrong.
No, you're correct. You're correct. Absolutely. Yes. No, you do not use drops in your cider. We use only picked, washed, graded apples. That being said, when we go out and we have pickers, we just use local people that are our pickers. We don't bring in migrant workers because our orchard just isn't quite big enough. And that's a whole other set of regulations where you have to offer housing and you have to offer certain amenities and things. So we are just relying on our neighbors, basically, who work at the orchard with us and our family. And so when the pickers go out and pick, they are picking in bushel boxes, which is around 40 to 42 pounds of apples. When those apples come in to our packing house, I put them through a pressure washer, which just washes them with water that has been tested. That has to be tested once a year to make sure that it's clean and free of contaminants, which it is. And then they come onto my packing table. So the grade A apples, your perfect, pristine apple that you want to eat is going to go into the farm store to be sold. Sometimes they're small, they're misshapen, they may have a small blemish. Those have now been washed and are, pretty good. So they're what's going to go into cider, and they're what we're going to use. If something has broken skin or any kind of exposure at all, has just been scraped or a poke hole from a stem, that gets culled out completely. That doesn't even end up in cider. That ends up an animal feed kind of place. And so we have lots of farmers in the area, pigs, cows, sheep. That's where those apples will end up for the animal feed. If things are really bad, like really got smushed or something, that just gets thrown completely. We are inspected by the FDA. So we have regulations, a cull report we have to fill out. We have high standards of what we're doing. And when it comes to the cider production, everything's in a completely sanitary environment. The apples are washed. We're gloved up. We're using a stainless steel press that's sanitized using commercial sanitizer in between each press. Everything gets bottled directly after being UV treated, which is ultraviolet light treated. It's immediately sanitary bottled into brand new jugs that we buy from a company here in Maine, Quality Containers in Yarmouth, and then it comes right to you. So that's how I think our apple cider really meets the standards of being very fresh and very delicious. And as far as the apple varieties go, that does change week to week throughout the season because the apples ripen at different times, which I think is a really important point that a lot of people don't realize, and why I enjoy the education so much is because all apples do not ripen at the same time. And so cider does change in taste throughout the season based on what you're using. And there's some varieties that are my favorite. Honeycrisp are an absolutely wonderful apple to use in cider. They have a really high sugar content. They're nice and smooth, and they press nicely, meaning that when they go through our press, when they get ground up, when they go through the cloths, they press well. Whereas like a Cortland apple does not press well. Not that the flavor isn't there, but it itself, because of its composition, does not grind up, does not press well. So it's just that science of learning over the years, what blend are we going to do each week that's going to give you, the consumer, the best flavor, but is also going to give us the less headache, if that makes sense, because you want it to press well. Because once the apples have been ground and pressed under a hydraulic press, what you're left with is pumice. It's a dried out apple ground up pumice. That also goes to animal feed. So there's no waste here, or very, very little waste, I should say, amongst all the apples that we use. So
I remember talking to your dad years ago when we were out there with our kids, and we were talking about the press because I was being geeky and asking. And he said the end result, basically, it feels as dry as sawdust.
If you have the right apple and you're doing it right, it should. You should pick up that cloth, which was 42 pounds to start, and it'll just be a couple of pounds. It's really, really light.
I mean, it's extraordinary to me to think about, because we have done manual presses, right? Which are fun and enjoyable, but like it's still really wet at the end. You're not getting all the juice out. So I think if anybody drives by your place, they're going to be like, oh, that's cute. And it is. And it's great. But you would never know that there's this really impressive manufacturing operation going on there. And you certainly wouldn't know the engineering aspect and the hydraulic, which is one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, because I think that's typical, it strikes me, to a lot of different food processing. It's hidden away in a way, but there's a lot going on there.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the other misconception that it's really important to educate people about is that growing apples, and not just apples, all agriculture, your harvest time is a very finite window. For us, we usually open up right after Labor Day. This year I had a great crop, so I actually pressed into January, but usually call it to the end of December. So you're basically looking at September, October, November, and December. That's 4 months of really intense, really weather-driven, human-driven, kind of consumer-driven time to make your money, to sell your product, to sell your crop, to harvest your crop, all of that. But you're working year-round. I mean, we're pruning now. So there's no real time off. And I think that's a real misconception when it comes to the orchard, because you as the consumer come once a year. Usually, you come with your family one time. Oh, we're going apple picking. Here we are. And you have certain expectations of what you want as a consumer. You want your apple orchard to be clean, meaning that you want it mowed down. You want nice, clear paths, nice, clear signage. You want to have carts available. You want to have bags available. You want to have friendly people there greeting you, friendly people checking you out. And you want your fruit to taste great. You want your fruit to look great. And you want the weather to be nice and sunny and fall-like, which I cannot control. That's going to be my biggest thing I have to say when it comes to all this is I can't control the weather, and we're at the mercy of Mother Nature all the time, year round. So you come with your family that one day and want this pristine experience, but there's a lot that went into that so that you would have that experience. Because unfortunately, consumers are a little bit fickle. And if you come on a day that's cold and blustery, and maybe that apple variety you really wanted has already been picked out, or they're not exactly what you were hoping, or the flavor isn't where you thought, you're going to leave and you may not come back and see me again. So I'm being given one opportunity to prove to you that I have what you want and that I've done it in the most beautiful way possible. And of course, we appreciate our customers who have been coming for 22 years and come back and realize that hurricanes happen and bad weather does happen.
Well, I got to tell you, the hurricane story is oft told in my house, and we laugh every time. I think we were the only people there, and we were actually stunned that you guys were. Anyway, it was a ridiculous move and so much fun, and we have talked about it for years. I'm really impressed that you were just still pressing. The storage aspect and then keeping that going, I imagine, is we can go down that rabbit hole. But before we do that, I want to talk about the off-season part, which isn't really an off-season, it's just different. So you said you're pruning now. If you could kind of step us through, like, what is it that you have to do throughout the rest of the year to get to the fall where, if everything lines up, you have a great year?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the important thing to recognize when we talk about all this too is that my husband and I are running this essentially right now. I mentioned my parents are still involved, but they are both in their early 80s. They have slowed down and they do as much as they are physically able. So my father is out there pruning, but not to the capacity that he used to be. And my mom's great. She watches my 4-year-old, so I can go prune. But my husband works 2 full-time jobs. He is a middle school PE teacher. He's also the head athletic trainer at Mount View High School and middle school. And so he is gone. He's working, like tonight he has a basketball game. So he left this morning at 7:30. I won't see him until 9 o'clock tonight. He's got a wrestling meet on Monday. So he's working full time. So everything I'm describing, we're doing in between everything else. So basically starting the end of January, right about now, it's time to prune. So that means all of our pruners need to be oiled up and they need to be sharpened up. And we can only prune on days that we can stand it. I guess is a good way to put it. Like, it's got to be cold. Do you want the apple trees to be in dormancy? Like, I don't want it to be 60 degrees out now. No, I want snow. I want a lot of snow, which we don't have, but could use, because what that does is that insulates the tree trunks. And then when it melts in the spring, adds to the water table. So we want snow right now. We want it cold, but we don't want it bitter, bitter cold. Because what happens when it's bitter cold is, A, we can't stand it. It's just physically too hard to be out there because we're hand pruning every tree, all 1,700 trees by hand. But it's hard on the trees. They become very brittle. Each variety is different when it comes to pruning. You have to prune them differently. So you got to kind of know what you're doing. And some are snap easier than others, if that makes sense. So you have to be careful. It's not too cold on some of them because you'll actually damage the tree. We've been out there on snowshoes. We've been out there with face guards. I mean, any weather you can imagine. We've been out there in snow, rain, wind, but we try to start now because it does take so long to do because of the other factors I mentioned, just my husband working and we have a family and we're getting older and all these things. So we do that through January, February, March. We try to be done by April. So be done by April break when my kids are off from school, because by then, depending on the weather, you can start to see some buds coming out. And once it starts pushing buds, it's too late. It's really not a great idea to be pruning then. So we want to be done by then.
Is it not a good idea to be pruning then? Because it's like the tree has put so much effort into creating the buds that it's just extra damaging to the tree, like just takes a hit.
Well, yes. I mean, you want the tree to be in dormancy. Dormancy means that the tree is asleep, basically. When you are pruning, if it's too warm, like let's say we went out in June, you're going to be knocking blossoms off. You're not going to be knocking buds off. I mean, you're in the trees. You're physically in the trees. And so that's hard. But also you're allowing and you're opening up that tree to susceptibility of all of the diseases that are out there. Like that could be a whole other podcast. And I'm not an expert on that, but I do know quite a bit about the different diseases that apple trees are facing, what's invasive, what comes and goes, what we're dealing with now that maybe we weren't dealing with 5 years ago. And then we've got the pest control side of it. Japanese beetles were a huge problem this past year, which they hadn't been. So getting back to our pruning, so now we're into the end of April. Now we need to replant. So if we had trees that died over the winter, we've decided to replant. We have done that before because our trees are getting older and we have to replant. If there's new varieties we want to try, we're kind of maxed out on space. So I'm not putting in whole new blocks, but I am replacing rows and things. So that's happening in April and May. And then we have to start our spray regimen. And my husband is licensed in applications. And a lot of what we're spraying on our trees is foliar nutrients. And that is because the trees are old. So think of it like your body. As your body gets older, it needs more nutrients to keep doing the things it could do easily when it was younger. It's the same idea with apple trees. And so you're actually starting from the ground up. You're starting at the soil. And before they even planted these trees way back in 83, they did soil tests. And they said, is the soil sustainable for apple trees? Because not all soil is. And ours was, and we're on a slope. So we have good drainage, things like that. And so it's applying a lot of nutrients in the spring, and it's doing leaf analysis. We work with the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. They send out scouts who basically do leaf analysis, soil analysis to make sure that you're not really deficient in something that you really need so that we can keep producing at a commercial level. So we're doing that through the end of April, May, June, July, and then it's grass. When you have 15 acres of orchard, that's a lot of grass. And when you have the pollinators in, when it's bloom time in May, we do have 3 hives of our own. We bring in usually 3 more from a gentleman up in Dexter who we depend on. We need those bees. You want to knock down all the dandelions because you want the bees to go to the apple trees and not to the dandelions. But we do have a bee patch in the back that we grow some different varieties to attract natural pollinators. So you're mowing grass basically all summer long and doing maintenance. You're going around, you're fixing the fence. We have a giant fence around the orchard to try to keep deer out. We have birdhouses to try to help with pest control. So you're maintaining those. We have a 1-mile nature trail. So it's maintaining that and getting that ready for the season. Once we get into August, that's where we switch kind of to the business side. And that's where I'm placing all of my orders for what I need for products, for jugs, for labels, for caps, for bags, for baskets, new carts. I try to work with all Maine, if not New England, different producers. So my cheese, my jams, my jellies, all the value-added products I have to have in my farm store to attract the consumer, I try to get from Maine. I try to get as local as possible so that I'm supporting other businesses. Because if us as local businesses do not support each other, we're going to go away. So I try my very best to support those people and get in those products. Local crafters, local artisans, maple syrup, honey, all these things. So now we're into August and now we're just getting ready. And now it's setting up everything. It's getting pickers lined up. It's hiring people. It's doing schedules. It's making sure all of our equipment is up to snuff. You know, we're doing tractor maintenance. We're doing wagon maintenance. We're now getting all of our signs up. It feels like a lot because it is a lot to get all ready. So that first weekend after Labor Day, we're ready to go. We're open. We have our credit card machine ready to go. We've got our Wi-Fi set up. We've got our register set up. We've got cash ready to go. We've got the bags ready. You know, everything that goes into running a business that isn't run year round. Because normally if you run a business, you're doing restocking and you're doing some cleaning and things. But for us, like right now, my farm store is completely shut down. I don't have any heat in that building. So everything is completely like boarded up, shut up, taped up. Everything's put away. And I have to bring that all back out in August, get it all set up. So when you come in, you know, September 10th, you're like, oh, this looks exactly how I remember it. And it looks great. And I love it. And here I am. So that's kind of the year. We're open September, October, November, into December. And then I'm buttoning everything back up, putting everything back away for the year, making sure that our press is all sanitized, ready to go for the next year, making sure that all of our records are done, doing taxes, of course. That's the fun part of running a business. That's this time of year. And then we're doing it again. So the years just kind of go around.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it sounds like, you know, it's 4 months of hardcore business and 8 to 12 months of tending the trees and the orchard and what I would call the science part of it. Like talking about the farm stand and the farm store. I'm sure there's a huge social science aspect to that I am missing that you know way more about than I do. So that is a whole other really interesting conversation. I'm going to circle back to what you said about pests and Japanese beetle. And this was part of the conversation we had in the fall is trying to account for new issues and problems at the farm. Like you're constantly having to learn new approaches while also incorporating what you know works. And I'm curious about that balance, right? Like how do you figure all that out?
Absolutely. And I think this is a really important point that one size does not fit all. When it comes to growing fruit, whether you're a backyard grower or a commercial grower, it depends on where you are. It depends on what you're dealing with. It depends on the weather for that year. So we are IPM, which stands for Integrated Pest Management Growers. That is our management plan when it comes to both pests and disease. IPM focuses on a holistic approach to trying to do as many preventative measures as humanly possible and not blanket spraying pesticides because we're conscientious of the world that we live in and the food that we eat. And we don't want to offer something that is unsafe. And we don't. I feel that what we are doing with our practices with IPM is really trying to, just like I was saying earlier, build up the body, build up the tree so that it's as healthy as preventative medicine. Make that tree, make that soil, make that apple as healthy as possible going into it. And then it has a better chance of just producing the way that it should. That being said, it depends on the year. If you have a really, really wet year, wet spring, and it rains constantly, you're going to have more fungus. You and your house are going to have more fungus around your house. You're just going to notice it. In contrast, if you have a very, very dry year, dry spring, you are going to have more pests because they have not been drowned out. They're just going to replicate more and more. So every year is a little bit different when it comes to how we're treating our trees, how we're treating the soil. We try to do preventative measures. Japanese beetles were something we had never dealt with in the level that we dealt with this past spring. So yes, we do have to apply insecticides to keep them down because otherwise they will decimate the trees and kill them. So it's finding that balance between offering safe fruit for people to eat and making them pretty enough that people want to eat them, if that makes sense. There's lots of different approaches out there when it comes to disease control and pest control. We feel we're doing what's best that works for us. Like I mentioned earlier, we're using birdhouses, even as simple as that, to try to keep insect populations down. We use sticky ball traps, which help capture apple maggot flies. Those are a non-invasive way to stop the problem before they ever even get to the apple. And like I said, and just keeping the apple trees really as healthy as you can. Another is the pruning. We prune to keep our apple trees down so that we have semi-dwarf trees. So that allows the consumer to come and be able to pick the apples without needing ladders, which is great, but it's also opening those trees up so that as wind comes through, as air comes through, you're allowing air movement to come in and kind of wipe out things on their own. So if you do have a really wet spring and you are dealing with a fungal growth because it's so wet, if you have pruned the apple trees well enough, it's allowing wind to come through to kind of take care of that for you. So when you use the word science, that's the science of trying to find that balance, trying to keep the trees open, but not too open, healthy, but then dealing with what problems you inevitably are going to have. You're never going to have a perfect growing season. You just hope for the absolute best and do what you can as best that you can. I mean, 2 years ago, in the spring of 2023, we had a frost in late May that killed off over 50% of our crop. There was absolutely nothing we could have done. You couldn't help the frost coming. It was late May. We already had bloom. We were pushing buds. And we went through the day after, my dad and I, and we were cutting open stamens, and they were all black. And my dad and I just cried. And we said, okay, we've lost 90% of our crop. Because as you went along, this is what Renee Moran at the UMaine Extension, she's a tree fruit specialist. This is what she had recommended that we do, that we go out, and we were really devastated. When the crop came in that year, 2 years ago, we were pleasantly surprised that we only had about 50% crop loss, depending on where in the orchard the trees were located, whether they were kind of in a low zone or a higher zone. So sometimes we do all the best that we can, and sometimes you just have to deal with what is, if that makes sense.
100%. The whole time you've been talking, I've been thinking, I wonder how many people that Emily graduated with an English degree are doing this work.
Well, I'll be honest. I mean, I didn't set out to do this. When I was growing up, I was definitely a teenager who said, I am never going to live in Dixmont, Maine, and I am never going to do this. But I did go out and see the world. I did a study abroad in York, England when I was in college. I moved to Illinois with my brother for a year. I went to Keene State, New Hampshire, which is still New England, but was not home. And I think there's some value in coming home. And I have a real pride in what we're doing. I have a real pride in the orchard, and I love it. And I enjoy the business side of it. I enjoy people. And I really enjoy the connections that I make. I enjoy people like yourself that I recognize that come year after year. Yeah, maybe I didn't know what you did for a job, but I know your face. I know your family. I watch your kids grow, and I have hundreds of families like that. And that's the part that brings me the most joy and the positivity, because I know the fruit that we are putting out there is good to eat, is safe to eat, is healthy for you. And I think there's something to be said when it comes to talking about all of this, is that you can buy apples anywhere. You can go to Walmart. You can go to Hannaford. You can buy apples anywhere. But there is something special about going and meeting the person who put the love into that apple, quite literally, their time, and grew the apple for you and can pick it off and put it in your hand and you can eat it immediately. I mean, I think there's something really special about that. And that's what makes Maine a great state, is that I'm not the only orchard in the area. And I tell people this every year. You don't have to come see me. You can go to your favorite orchard that's closer to your home, but go to an orchard. Support us, support local people, support local business, especially orchardists, because that's what I am.
Well, I will say it just tastes better. On top of everything, like if you need another push, it just genuinely tastes better, right? Like everything super fresh tastes better. So you mentioned your trees are getting older. Is there a life expectancy for apple trees? And I know that trees can last for a very long time, certainly relative to human life. But I mean, like as a production, as an orchard-based tree, is there an expected lifetime, or you can extend it for however long you need to with the work that you and your husband are doing to build it up every year?
Well, that's a great question. The short answer is I'm not really sure. I can tell you what I know from experience for our orchard. The trees that are now 42 years old are still producing at a commercial level because of the pruning practices, because we're giving so much to the soil, all of those nutrients we're giving every year. However, their production does go down. And actually, pick your own operations make the production go down a lot faster, because the people that come in and pick apples are not as gentle as we would like them to be. And they're breaking off branches and they're breaking off buds. And when you break branches and when you're rough and when you're ripping apples off the tree, you're actually hurting next year's crop. So we do a little bit of a crop rotation, which is we do shut down certain rows for pick your own to allow those trees to come back. So far, that has worked for us for certain varieties. And when I say certain varieties, I mean like McIntosh, Cortland, Empire, Golden Delicious, Red Delicious, some of your standard varieties. Now, I don't offer pick your own on all of my varieties for that reason, because of the damage aspect, but also because of what I was talking about earlier. Not all apples ripen at the same time. And for certain varieties, they ripen unevenly on the tree. So Honeycrisp is a prime example. Honeycrisp apples, because they have such a high sugar content, when you look at a Honeycrisp apple tree, and if you have a backyard tree, you may notice this, the leaves are a different color. Because what's happening is that Honeycrisp apple is actually sucking all of the sugar out of the leaves into the apple. So the leaves will actually turn yellow before the apple's even ripe. And you'll say, oh my gosh, my tree's dying, what's happening? But it's actually sucking all of that sucralose and sugar out. When you go up to a Honeycrisp apple tree, you have to pick them at exactly the right time because of that high sugar content. So if you're picking an underripe Honeycrisp in your left hand, and you're picking a ripe Honeycrisp in your right hand, which are both on the tree at exactly the same time, the one in your left hand that's underripe is not going to taste right. You're going to bite into it and you're going to say, oh, that doesn't taste like a Honeycrisp at all. I'm not coming back to this orchard ever. But maybe the one in your right hand was perfectly ripe and you're like, oh, this is the best apple I've ever eaten. I love this orchard. I'm coming back. So that's one of the reasons I don't offer pick your own on Honeycrisp, because it's really hard to differentiate. And there's just no physical way I could explain that to every person coming through. But as far as the life expectancy of these trees, we're going to keep going as long as we can. Some varieties are not as popular, as I mentioned earlier, and so I've chosen to replace some of those trees planted in 83, which is only the first 500 block. The other orchards that I have basically 4 blocks. One is from like 83, one is from the early 90s, one is from 2007, and one is from 2009. And those are all producing still really well. It takes about 5 to 7 years to commercially produce apples, to have the tree get big enough and to get enough apples. If you have a backyard tree, it's important too that if, like, let's say you went and planted 2 backyard trees this spring that were already 2-year-old whips, 2-year-old plantings. You're not planting from seed, obviously. You're going to start seeing apples, not maybe this year, but next year. You need to pick those apples off. You don't want them producing apples the first couple of years because you want all the energy to go into the trunk, into the root system. You don't want it producing apples. So within 3-4 years, yeah, you can start picking off your 6 or 8 apples that are all going to be, the size of softballs. They're all going to be nice and big. And that's what happens with commercial orchards too. If you ever have been to a commercial orchard where it's relatively young, within 10 years, you're going to say, these are the biggest apples I've ever seen, because they're not producing as many, but they're producing in size. And so our trees, like our McIntosh trees that are from 1983, I have a lot of them, but they may not be, all softball size, because they produce a lot of apples, but they're not going to be as large that way. And certain varieties are larger than others. Honeycrisp, they're a great big apple. Shizuka's, beautiful yellow apple. McCowan's, tiny. Great apple, lovely apple, very low in acid, excellent apple. But they really should be hand thinned because they put out so many blooms, or chemically thinned, and we choose not to use chemical thinners. So therefore you have more, but they're smaller.
I'm so psyched you said that about McCowan's, because those are one of my favorites. And I'm always like, gosh, why aren't these bigger? I want more of this. I mean, they're really good.
And McCowan's are well known. They're a McIntosh Jersey Black cross. They're a very low acid apple. They have excellent flavor, very thin skin. But you're right, they are a smaller apple because you really should go through and hand thin them every spring. But I'm sorry, I don't have time for that.
It's all right. We all understand that there's only so many hours in the day. All right, before I let you go, I'm going to put you on the spot. 2 on-the-spot questions. What's your favorite apple? And this is less on the spot and just kind of curiosity. If you could pick kind of a new variety, let's say you got magically another, couple acres and you were going to try something funky, what would you do?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have done some funky stuff. We've done some like antique cider varieties to try to kind of tap into that market. About 5 years ago, everybody was making hard cider. Everybody wanted all of those weird kind of offbeat apples. And so we have planted some of those. Fresh eating, no, they're specific for that. And I have some really great contracts with some really great people throughout the state that do buy those apples to make specialty hard cider, specialty wines. We just did a contract this year with Sweetgrass Winery. They took 750 gallons of sweet cider that they were making into all kinds of delicious brandies and cocktails and cordials. That's a whole other podcast that I don't know a lot about. But as far as sweet eating goes, my favorite apple is the Jonah Gold apple, which is a cross between a Jonathan and a Golden Delicious. They come out in early October. They're just super crunchy, super sweet. They're really delicious. We have done some young plantings of some of the new and up and coming varieties that we are able to get. And I'll explain what that means. Like Sweet 16. I have a couple of young trees. Those are going to be really popular. People really like those. Crimson Crisp. We just planted within the last couple of years. They've started producing excellent, really hard, nice and crunchy. So yeah, there's a lot of that. I'm a sweet apple person. I really like them. That being said, I don't think I've eaten a Macintosh in probably 15 years. They are not my favorite.
They're not my favorite either. There's so many good apples out there. And I grew up with Macintosh. I'm like, I need something different.
Yeah, but people that know them love them, and that's why we grow them. Red Delicious actually are a really great apple, fresh picked. They have a nice sweet flavor. I think they get a bad rap because they were in everybody's lunchbox when they were growing up. And that's because they store really well. We do not have CO2 storage. We just use cold storage. So that's why I don't have apples. Like I will get calls, for the next couple of months, do you still have apples? I'm sorry, I don't. Because I don't have CO2 storage. That's where apples are kept in a kind of an enclosed chamber with CO2 pumped in. And that's what allows them to stay fresh for a long time. However, it does dry them out. So those Red Delicious you're buying in the store that are natively grown in kind of May, that's where they've been kept. And that's why they kind of just get a little dried out that way. But yeah, some of those odd varieties. If I had a lot more space, I think I would go into some more of that sweet stuff like the Sweet 16s. What I was mentioning earlier is there are some apples out there that you can buy in places like Walmart, Sam's Club, Hannaford, whatever, that are not grown locally. They're probably grown in Washington State, which is the biggest apple producer in the country. And those are called club apples. So basically you had to buy into the club, so to speak, in the beginning when they were in development. And if you did not buy into that club, then you cannot get them. You physically cannot get the trees. It is illegal to graft those trees, and you can be taken to court if you ever grafted them. So Sweet Tango is an example of that. Those are apples that I unfortunately cannot grow. But if you can get them, taste really great. I do have to buy apples in the grocery store usually in the spring because I have kids and they really like the jazz apple. Again, just really nice and sweet, things like that.
Cool. You mentioned you have pear trees. Is the management of those similar?
It is. And I am not a pear expert by any means, but they are pruned similarly. They are treated with the nutrients the same. And they're kind of spread out throughout the orchard. We have Bartlett pears, Spartlet pears, sugar pears, D'Anjou pears. This was a great pear year. We had a lot. And I sold them individually. And then I would sell kind of the seconds to people who were making pear jam, pear wine, things like that. But they're picked pretty much the same and grown pretty much the same. I just not always great about knowing their ripeness. My dad and I kind of joke because I am the taste tester. So when we think an apple is ripe, we go around. We pluck one off the tree. I try it. I say, no, it's not quite ready yet. Or, yep, it's ready to be picked. And so with pears, they tend to ripen overnight. So you'll go and drive around because we scout every single morning, throughout the season. And we go around and say, oh, those pears look good. Next day, they'll all be on the ground. And you'll say, well, but they ripen really, really quickly sometimes. And they're so heavy that they fall. So you have to kind of watch it that way. But
have you noticed that having the pears have helped with the cross-pollination? The health? Yeah, like it's made a big difference kind of thing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The thing about pears is I think it's a little different than apples, especially as they get close to ripe, is that I think they give off a real sweet smell to the bees and yellow jackets, which isn't as advantageous because it does bring in yellow jackets. And that's another pest problem that you have to deal with is that I do a lot of school groups throughout the fall. And as you all remember, this past fall, we were in October. It was 75 degrees. It was too warm. And so when you're bringing all these little kindergarten and first grade kids in to come pick apples, and now it's 75 degrees outside, great. Yeah, they're all in T-shirts. But any apple or any fruit that's on the ground, especially ones that have been smushed or pears, they're attracting, yellow jackets, which is a problem because then you have all of these little kids. So then I have to kind of rework, okay, what section of the orchard am I going to put these children in to give them the least amount of risk from these pests? So pest problems just never end.
Emily, I could keep going with this conversation literally for hours. I feel like we just scratched the surface, but I think what's best is, for me, you've touched on so many different pieces of understanding the year as someone who's working with living things. There's not any one exact science. And I love how you talk specifically about who you're working with other orchards and Maine Cooperative Extension. There's a whole wealth of knowledge of folks that you rely on, but you still need to know this stuff. And I think this has been a really great conversation to help people realize you're integrating all this science, whether you specifically even realize it or not. I know you know it, but I don't know that it's obvious when you think about it. So what you need to do next is some type of business podcast, not with me, so people can understand what it takes when you're relying on natural living things as your business model, because that is very difficult.
Well, I will say, though, I think that for everyone listening, there's a lot of people who want to know more. And I'm open to answering any questions anytime. We do get a lot, especially in the fall when I'm open, of people who want to know, hey, I have a couple backyard trees. What can I do? And quite honestly, I send people to the University of Maine Extension. They have a fabulous website with all the information you can imagine on how to grow your own backyard trees, how to deal with pests, how to deal with disease. You can send them your own leaf analysis, your own soil analysis. They will take care of that for you. You can actually have a scout come to your house. So if you're really interested in growing your own backyard orchard, that's an excellent resource. And they have a plethora of knowledge, way more than I have, although I'm happy to give out as much as I can. Like I said earlier, I enjoy the people aspect of all of this the most, but I also have a real pride in what I'm doing. And I am learning every day. I am learning new things all the time. We just went down to the trade show down in Augusta and took some classes and talked to some other orchards. I love going to other orchards. I go to North Star Orchards and see Jen up there, and she has so much information, and I've learned so much from her, and she's a great person to kind of bounce things off of. She's also got a family-run orchard. So it's a learning curve, and I've enjoyed the last 17 years, and I hope we'll still be going for another 17 at least.
Excellent. This was great. I really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate you letting me grill you about apples even just a little bit.
Oh, happy to do it. Happy to do it.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by following us on your podcast platform of choice. And please leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is executive produced and hosted by me, Kate Dickerson, and edited and produced by Scott Loiselle. And the Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.